Welcome to How to Become a Production SQL Database Administrator. My name is Raphael. In this video, we're going to look at the concept of database snapshot. I'm going to show you how to create a database snapshot and why we use database snapshots in the production world. Before we get into the T-SQL and understanding of it, let's look at some of our notes. So what is a database snapshot? A database snapshot provides a read-only static view of the source database as it existed at the time we created the snapshot. And what I mean by that is when we created database snapshots, it's basically making a copy, if you will, of the source database. And we'll see some of the provisions that allow us to do that. A couple of notes about the database snapshot. Database snapshots are dependent on the source database. So when you create a copy, if you will, of the source database, the snapshots are extremely dependent on the source database. And why am I saying that? Because if the source database becomes corrupt or is unavailable for any reason, all snapshots for each database that you created a snapshot against become unavailable. Another thing, snapshots must be on the same server as the instance, so you can't have remote snapshots. Database snapshots operate on a data page level. And what I mean by data page level is that as each page of data is updated in the source or the production database, then it basically copies that original page from the source to the snapshot. And I'll be demonstrating that in a second in a PowerPoint to illustrate that point so you get a visual representation of what I mean by that. But remember, as I've mentioned, a page is the smallest unit of data in a database. This process of copying the original page from the source database to the snapshot database is called a copy on write operation. And I'll be explaining what that means also. The snapshot stores the original page, preserving the data records as they existed when the snapshot was created. And you'll hear me stressing repeatedly that this snapshot occurs and makes a snapshot, an original copy of pages at the time you do make a snapshot. So this is why I'm kind of re-emphasizing some of these things. So this is important to understand. Subsequent updates to the records in a modified page do not affect the contents of that. And again, I'll be demonstrating that to you in a SQL example. The copied original pages are stored in a sparse file. Now, initially, as you'll know, when we create a database snapshot, obviously there's a directory where I'll be sending that snapshot to. And as you'll notice here, and I'll show you that this is a great feature to have because even though you're making a shell of a copy of the production database or the source database, it's allocating extremely small disk space. It utilizes very disk space. So this is one of the advantages of creating a database snapshot. But like anything else, as more and more pages are updated in the source database, the size of the file grows in the snapshot database. And I'll be demonstrating that to you in a second. So before we begin, so what is the purpose then? Why do we use database snapshots? Well, snapshots can be used for for reporting systems purposes because it's only a read-only database. You cannot modify the snapshot database by inserts or deletes, and I'll be showing you that in a second. In the event of a user error of the source database, such that if, for example, you delete a table in the production database, then you can revert to the source database that has the initial pages of that table, and then you can do a restore, and I'll show you that in a second. So this is the great benefit because if a deletion of a table occurs, then you can restore to that point in time of data from the snapshot, rather than doing a full database backup. If you have transaction differential backups, then you'll have to do those, and then followed by all the transactional backups. So this is a quick way of preserving data, if you will. But now, having said that, this is important, and I've put it in red. Because database snapshots are not redundant storages, they do not protect against disk errors or any other types of corruption. Taking regular backups and testing your restore plan, as we've spoken about in the first session, is essential to protect your database. Snapshots are not a substitute for backups. So don't ever rely on this because you've made a snapshot of the database thinking it's a backup. It is not. So let me emphasize this. Make sure you understand this very important concept, that just because you're making database snapshots of the database, it is not a backup. You must continue with your backups. So now that we've looked at some of the academics, let's jump on DDA SQL and see how this actually works. So as you'll notice here, I'm on the Object Explorer here under the Database Snapshot folder. If I right click, you'll see, if I refresh it, you'll see I can't create a database snapshot. The way you do that actually is through T-SQL. So the first thing I'm going to do actually is I'm going to create a new database for our purposes. So let me correct that here. So I'm going to create a database called DBS, Database Snapshot, and this is going to be the primary source production database. So I'm going to create this, and if I go here and refresh it, there's my database. Now this is the production database that has no tables. In that database, I'm going to use that newly production database. And I'm going to create a table called names. I'm going to insert into the table 3 values, Albert, Bob, and Charles, and then I'm going to view it. So I'm going to just highlight all this and execute. So now in that database, if I refresh the tables, you'll see that the table called names has been created with these 3 entries, Albert, Bob, Charles. Now this is the production database. This is the source database. I have not created a snapshot of this. So let's look at a few things. To view all the databases, including the DBS, you can use this select all from sys databases. And if I execute this, you'll note that indeed that database has just been created that I just created. So this is a list of all the databases. So now, in order for me to create a database snapshot of a database, I need to know the logical name of the data file. And to retrieve that, you do the SPL database followed by the database name. This is the production name. And you're going to hear me emphasize the difference all the time. So as I execute this, this is the production database. This is the logical database that I need. So I grab that. And now I'm going to create the database snapshot. You'll notice in my notes that it's create database. Now obviously you can use your own naming convention, but I like to put the word snapshot before the database name. This way I know it's a snapshot database. This is obviously the logical name that we were trying to discover, and so you put the name of the logical data file right here, followed by the path. Now this is where the snapshot's going to reside. So it's on my C drive under snapshots folder, and I've called it snapshot_dbs.ss. This extension is for snapshot, but it can be anything. So this is the location, and then you say as snapshot of the database you want to make a copy of, if you will. Now if I go to my folder here, you'll see that I do not have a file here. So as soon as I create this now and execute, it's completed. So now if I go to my file, there is the file that is kept. Now if I go to my database snapshot and I refresh it, you'll see that it actually exists right there. One thing I would note is that look at the size of the database. And I want you to note that even though I created a copy, if you will, of a snapshot of the production database DBS, if I look at the data files, so there's the data file of the production database. If I go right click and properties, you'll notice that on the disk is taking almost 3.1 or 3.2 megabytes. If I look at the same file that I just created for the snapshot, and if I look at its properties and look at the disk size on disk, you'll see it's just 128 megabytes. So it's a fraction of the database. So this is, as you can see, it hardly takes up any space of that. And this is a great advantage also. So I'll leave that here. So now what happens is, so in a production database, this is the production database. And now I've got a copy of that, if you will. And here's the production table called names. Now, let's say I drop this table, or a user who should not have had the permission to drop, accidentally drops it. So he drops the table from the production database, and it's gone. If I go to my production or source, you'll see that I've lost that table. Now, obviously, in order for me to retrieve that table, I would have to do a full database backup. I would have to restore a full database backup. I would have to restore any differentials if I had any. Then I would have to restore all the transactional logs to get that one table back. But because I have a copy, if you will, of that, I can actually retrieve the data from here. So now I'm going to restore that table called names from the snapshot that I made. And the command is as follows: use master, go, restore database DBS from database snapshot equal the snapshot database. So if I highlight this and execute, it'll just take a split second. Now if I go to my database and refresh it, look at the tables, you'll notice indeed that I have, just to verify that the table had those 3 names, and it does. So this is a quick way of retrieving data from a snapshot. Now, inserting new data into a production database. Now, what I'm going to do now is, this is the production table called names, as you can see in DBS. I'm going to insert a record called Eugene. And then I'm going to look at that names. And now you see I have 4 records, obviously, with the insertion of Eugene. Now, did that update occur? Did the update occur in the database and table of the snapshot? Well, let's look at it. Let's move to our snapshot database. So as you can see, I've directed myself to that snapshot. And now if I look at the select names, you'll see it has not been updated. And the answer is no. As the snapshot only contains the copy at the time the snapshot was created. So remember that. Can you update or insert the snapshot database or table? Well, let's look at that. Let's log on to our database, which we have. And now I'm going to update the names table to IT department. I'm going to go execute. And obviously it's going to fail. Cannot update or insert or delete, as it is read only. And as you can see, as I mentioned earlier, this database is read only. So that's the great advantage. And then you can obviously drop it if you wish with a drop statement. So this is a great advantage of using a database snapshot. It allows recovery of data to that point for quick recovery if the need arises. But you can actually create it for other purposes also, such as a reporting system, if it's not a heavily used system. So this gives you an introduction as to what is a database snapshot and how to utilize it. So I think I'll leave it here and we'll continue there. Well, let me actually show you one of the things here, which I should have showed you, but it doesn't matter because it's the same thing. Here you'll notice, as I said, now actually this will make it a little more easier now that we've gone through that process. Here's a source table with the various data in it. Now, when you create a snapshot database, it contains virtually an empty file. There's very little data, but virtually empty. The snapshot database contains an empty file, and you see that. So when you create a snapshot of the source database, you essentially create a copy of a shell of the source database. The snapshot database does not take up any disk space until you modify the source database. So what that means is right here, until you modify the database. And what that means is, now, here is the source database. If I modify the database, for example, on table 1 and table 5, what the database snapshot will do is it will take a copy of that action at that time for table 1. It will take a copy of that action of the original data of table 5 and table 1 and place it here. And as each modification occurs here, the snapshot database keeps recording the original source of that database. And as you can see, that's why I've increased it. Obviously, the size will eventually grow as you make more modifications to the source database. So as you modify the source database, the snapshot copies of the original data of the source database, this will call database snapshot files to grow. So this, actually, I'm glad I showed you to it this way, because I think this makes a little more sense now. So I think I'm going to leave it there, and we'll continue with the next one. And now you have a clear understanding, or a good understanding, of what database snapshots are and how to create them and how to use them. And I'll leave it here, and I'll see you in the next video. So my name is Raphael, and this is how to become a production SQL database administrator. See you in the next video.